Good evening and welcome. It is time once again for CU Immigration here on WRFU LP Urbana 104.5 FM. I will be your host for this evening. My name is Mr. Garza, and I'm here to let you know that WRFU is an open forum for the Urbana-Champaign community. Views expressed are those of the speakers, in this case myself, and are not intended to represent WRFU or UCIMC, or, as we like to say on the televised version of this show, UPTV. These views are our own. I'm coming to you once again from my undisclosed location here in somewhere in the greater Champaign-Urbana metropolis. We're still on lockdown here, and I'm still staying home and still staying healthy. This show doesn't have a whole lot of a theme, this show doesn't have much of a theme. There, I fixed it. Beyond the fact that many of these articles touch on the virus, that's pretty much everything that's anybody is talking about in the news these days, and for a fairly good reason, because it's a big deal, and it's affecting a lot of people in a lot of ways. Immigrants are uniquely vulnerable right now, both because of the current administration and their attitude towards immigrants, and their more precarious position in terms of how long they've been here, what kinds of support networks they have been able to form for themselves, what kind of support networks there are that exist in general for people. And so it's a difficult time for everybody, obviously, and in particular for immigrants. And so a lot of these stories will naturally revolve around that topic. So I've just highlighted a few things that seemed interesting to me that I wanted to share with you, and hopefully you will find something here that will interest you as well. So my first article is entitled, "The Coronavirus Has Derailed the Citizenship Oath for Thousands of Immigrants Who Are Anxious to Vote." Luis Molina had waited months to complete the final step in his decades-long journey to become an American citizen, repeating the oath of allegiance to the United States along with hundreds of other would-be citizens on March 19th. Molina, a 51-year-old who left El Salvador as a young man, had planned to hold a celebratory dinner at his favorite restaurant in Pasadena, California, President Thai, after the naturalization ceremony in Los Angeles. To become a U.S. citizen, immigrants must go through a long and at times arduous process that includes an interview with an immigration officer and a test on American civics and the English language. The final step, however, is the easiest of them all, repeating 140 words in a celebratory event that's often held in American theaters, convention centers, and courthouses. This simple but legally necessary step is all that stands in the way of Molina being granted citizenship. But that opportunity has been on hold. In March, naturalization ceremonies across the country were canceled due to the rapid spread of the coronavirus, and the agency that administers immigration benefits, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, or USCIS, closed its offices to the public. The ceremonies are supposed to be rescheduled, but like many other parts of American life, the timing is uncertain. In wake of the cancellations, immigrants like Molina fear that not only won't get the chance. Okay, there's the word. Let me try that again. In wake of the cancellations, immigrants like Molina fear that they not only won't get the chance to call themselves Americans anytime soon, but that they won't be able to vote in the upcoming presidential election. Experts warn that the delayed naturalizations could have an impact on the number of eligible voters in November, as many states require registration by October. I'm kind of nervous, Molina said. He's watched how the Trump administration has enforced the public charge rule, which penalizes green card applicants from using public benefits and other restrictive immigration policies. I've been thinking about how they changed the rules and the laws, and maybe I won't be able to get citizenship. I feel intimidated. A U.S. CIS spokesperson said field offices will send notices with instructions to applicants with scheduled interviews or naturalization ceremony appointments, which will automatically be rescheduled once normal operations resume. Some ceremonies in Los Angeles that had been scheduled for later in May have yet to be canceled, but California officials have indicated that strict social distancing measures could last beyond that. Under normal conditions, USCIS is able to naturalize 66,000 immigrants on average every month, according to Sarah Pierce, an analyst at Migration Policy Institute. The agency generally relies on in-person oaths at its office or in larger ceremonies outside of its own facilities. So far, because of COVID-19, there are already tens of thousands of immigrants who have had their naturalizations delayed, and these numbers will easily exceed 100,000 as this crisis drags on, she said. The agency regularly hosts ceremonies that pack more than 1,000 soon-to-be Americans in one place to conduct the oath altogether. If USCIS offices are able to open as planned on May 3rd, the agency will still face an inherent challenge. How will large groups of people be quickly naturalized? Unless USCIS implements an ambitious series of naturalization ceremonies once they are able to reopen in-person services, there will be tens of thousands of immigrants who will not be able to vote in this fall's election, despite having completed nearly all the legal requirements to receive citizenship, Pierce said. Because naturalization ceremonies entail gatherings of large groups of people, there are a lot of outstanding questions about when USCIS will be able to restart these and what exactly they will look like. If the ceremonies are limited by public health concerns, unless USCIS comes up with innovative solutions, these delays could reverberate for years to come. Former senior USCIS leaders told this reporter that the cancellations will inevitably have an impact on the number of people who are able to obtain citizenship this year. Field offices are 100% closed, meaning not just no naturalization ceremonies, but no naturalization interviews, and also no green card interviews, said Leon Rodriguez, former director of the agency under the Obama administration. All of this was already severely backlogged before, so the problem will become much worse depending on the length of the closure. As of September 2019, there were already more than 600,000 naturalization applications pending. The naturalization oath has been a long-held American tradition spanning back to the late 1700s. Before the early 1900s, courts from across the country administered the oath in various ways, and it wasn't until 1929 that a standardized oath was created. Later, the Immigration Act of 1950 added language to the oath that made immigrants promise to bear arms for the U.S. and perform non-combatant service in the armed forces of the United States when required by law. There are waivers for the requirement to recite the oath, like if an individual does not agree to bear arms for the U.S. because of religious circumstances, or has a developmental disability that prevents them from understanding the oath. But in most circumstances, it is required. It's like being on the 1-yard line and suddenly there's a timeout that may last for months. If you can't take the oath of allegiance, a pro forma final step, but a moving one, then you can't become a U.S. citizen, said Doug Rand, who worked on immigration policy in the Obama White House and is now the co-founder of Boundless Immigration, a technology company that helps immigrants obtain green cards and citizenship. That means you can't vote, of course. It also means you can't count on being safe from deportation or on protecting your family by sponsoring them for U.S. citizenship. Rand has advocated for the agency to skip the live event altogether in light of the pandemic, while others have called for oaths to be administered via televideo. Duncan Williams, a professor of religion at the University of Southern California, had also been scheduled to recite the oath of citizenship in Los Angeles on March 19th. Williams, 50, who came to the country as a 17-year-old from Japan for college. The Trump administration's restrictive immigration policies, such as the travel ban and the policy that led to families being separated at the border, created a sense of urgency for Williams to obtain his citizenship. What is more unsettling is the uncertainty about the future implicated in the inability to complete the naturalization process, he said. Williams had expected to get his U.S. passport and vote in the upcoming elections, confident in his status as an American. As a Japanese national, he said, I've been observing the rising anti-Asian sentiment in the U.S. with some trepidation, with some regret that the protections afforded to citizens is not something I can secure at the present time. So this is just one of many things that's going on right now that is creating problems for immigrants, and some might say not a huge one in the vast scheme of things, but it is certainly a problem that is going to compound and become worse over time as more and more of these are pushed back with no scheduled date for when they're going to be completed. These people are ready to become citizens, and they can't. They're just stuck. And that's holding up their lives in all sorts of ways, each with their own personal story, I'm sure. Anyway, our next article is entitled COVID-19. Immigrants face language, financial barriers during crisis. We talked some before a couple weeks ago about the financial problems, but the language problems are a difficulty too. So let's see what they have to say here. The unknowns faced by new immigrants in Canada have multiplied in wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, but the immigration process hasn't slowed, officials say. Exemptions to current travel advisories allow temporary foreign workers, international students, and approved permanent residents to enter the country despite ongoing restrictions barring non-essential travel to stop the spread of the novel coronavirus. And editorial aside here, this article is from Canada, about Canada. So some of the specifics will be different than here in the U.S., but I think some of this will be the same kind of problem. Anyway, those coming into the country are required to pass a health check and isolate for 14 days after arriving. But the days and weeks since the pandemic hit Canada have created new challenges for newcomers, says Asuka Hirai, director of the Victoria Immigrant and Refugee Center Society, or the VIRCS. Some of our clients, they may have lost their jobs, she said. Many are new and just got hired, so some qualify for EI, or employment insurance, but some don't. Hirai says some of the new Canadians who can access EI are still struggling. Many of them are having difficulties applying for benefits because they have low literacy skills, she said, so it has been difficult for them to navigate the system to access resources. And VIRCS, like many other organizations, including the Immigrant Services Society of BC, has closed its offices, providing all services remotely by phone or online. That's a difficult adjustment when language is already a barrier. Because we're not seeing them face to face, sometimes it takes longer to apply for the benefits, she explained. Case managers taking more time to understand their stories, what the struggles are, so they can apply for the proper benefits. People with permanent resident applications still being processed, the federal government has extended deadlines for 90 days for steps that might be difficult during the pandemic, such as submitting passports or police certificates, or completing an immigration medical exam. Applicants also have 90 days to submit their biometrics instructions letter, which provide proof of document submission. Citizen applications may be delayed but are ongoing, according to the federal government. All citizenship ceremonies, tests, and retests are canceled until April 13. The government says refugee resettlement programs are paused but will resume when conditions permit. Now, you can see there's a big difference here in how Canada is dealing with immigrants and how the U.S. is dealing with them. There, it seems to be just procedural problems that are being addressed as they come up, or are at least being looked into. Here, there are procedural problems, there are all sorts of problems, and if any of them are being addressed, it's hard to see what they are and who's doing it. So, big difference in treatment. All right. Excuse me. Our next article is entitled States and Localities Step Up to Support Immigrant Families When Congress Fails. We're back in the U.S. again, obviously, as you can tell by the title. Coronavirus legislation enacted to date, including the Families First and the CARES Act, doesn't go far enough to address the vast inequities in how immigrant communities are affected by the public health and economic crisis. While Congress has shamefully excluded millions of immigrants and their families, states have stepped up to fill the gap by providing relief to immigrant families. Long-standing policies have failed immigrant communities for decades. Before coronavirus became a threat, non-citizens were already significantly more likely to be uninsured, and most immigrants are ineligible for federal means-tested public benefits during the first 5 years in their status. Increased immigration enforcement, the discriminatory new public charge regulation, and a relentless drumbeat of anti-immigrant rhetoric from the Trump administration have intensified fears of accessing health care and other programs. Recent congressional actions exacerbate existing inequities. For example, by failing to ensure that everybody has access to COVID-19 testing and treatment. The CARES Act also prevents taxpayers who use an Individual Taxpayer Identification Number, or ITIN, from receiving stimulus checks. This reckless approach to policymaking will harm over 5 million children, whose parents will be ineligible for assistance that could help their families weather these challenging times. The need for increased access by immigrant families to programs that meet basic needs is more acute now than ever. Many immigrants with low incomes working in housekeeping, caregiving, restaurants, and other service sectors have already lost their jobs. 6 million immigrant workers, including DACA recipients, in industries like agriculture, construction, and healthcare, are the front lines of keeping U.S. residents healthy and fed during the pandemic. These workers are often required to be in close quarters or interact with the public, putting them at higher risk of getting sick. In the face of federal inaction, states and localities have stepped in to provide greater and more equitable access to programs that help people survive this crisis. The following list provides a few examples of the many ways that state and local governments are supporting immigrant families. Healthcare access. Several states have long used state-only funds to provide health insurance to immigrants who are disqualified by federal restrictions. In New York and Washington, state health officials have announced that their emergency Medicaid programs, which serve people regardless of immigration status, will cover COVID-19 testing and treatment. Where states have not expanded eligibility, it's important to spread the word that immigrant families still have the right to seek care, even without insurance. Financial assistance. In Minneapolis, Mayor Jacob Frey is using his emergency powers to create a $5 million forgivable loan program to help renters and small businesses affected by the economic fallout. Unlike federal and state programs, the relief fund is also available to undocumented residents. In San Francisco, the Board of Supervisors has introduced legislation to create an emergency relief fund to provide financial assistance to families, including immigrant families, who are ineligible for federal programs. Nutrition assistance. This week, Michigan became the first state in the country to gain federal approval of a pandemic EBT, a program that will provide nutritious food to children regardless of immigration status who are affected by school closings. The governors of North Carolina and Florida have requested flexibility in the activation of a Disaster Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or DSNAP, that's available regardless of immigration status. However, they can't receive this until the president declares a federal disaster. In Seattle, the city is providing supermarket vouchers to families during the coronavirus pandemic. The ordinance states that if additional funding becomes available, immigrants and refugees should be prioritized. And finally, unemployment assistance. The New Jersey legislature has passed the temporary lost wage unemployment program that will provide benefits to workers, including undocumented immigrants, for certain time missed during COVID-19 related reasons. It is not yet clear if Governor Phil Murphy will sign the bill. In the face of the current public health and economic crisis, we must prioritize the millions of immigrants on the front line of COVID-19 response efforts in relief efforts. Policies that fail to address the systemic and historic exclusion of immigrants from assistance programs will only deepen existing inequities. Moving forward, CLASP is committed to working with our partners to advocate for bills like the Coronavirus Immigrant Families Protection Act that address crucial gaps left in the relief legislation enacted thus far. In the meantime, we applaud state and local efforts to provide access to health care, nutrition, and economic supports for all individuals and families impacted by this crisis. Now, this article points to a larger problem that we've been seeing throughout the country so far since the beginning of this pandemic, and that is the apparent inability of the federal government to respond in any kind of coordinated, comprehensive, or rapid way to developing events, and the fact that state and local governing bodies and non-government organizations are the ones stepping in and making sure that things happen. Around here in Champaign-Urbana, we have pretty good government, generally speaking, and they're stepping up and doing things, and this has been pretty decent experience overall in terms of how people are being covered and helped and cared for, I guess you might say. But federally speaking, if we were dependent on the federal government right now, we would be in big trouble. And in ways that we are dependent on the federal government, we are in big trouble. So we'll see how this plays out overall, but I suspect the feds will claim credit for all the hard work that the local groups have done when everything is all over with, and they'll pretend like they did it, but in fact, it's us, you and me, and the people in our communities that are making these things happen at this time. Anyway, moving on. Our next article is entitled, Immigrants Can Seek Coronavirus Care Without Fear. The U.S. government says a new rule disqualifying more people from green cards if they use government benefits will not apply to immigrants with coronavirus or virus symptoms if they seek care. And editorial aside, that's a pretty narrow description right there. A lot of people who are sick are not being tested, and a lot of people with symptoms are not being tested. And so it's going to be very difficult for someone to prove, unless they had the exact set of symptoms that is the common denominator, seems to be for most of the people who get this, but not everybody. They're going to have a hard time proving this. So I suspect in coming months, this will prove to be a problem where people are going to say, I was sick. I went in, I got tested, and now you're saying I shouldn't have. And anyway, I suspect this is going to come back to haunt people. But anyway, moving onward. U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services said late Friday that seeking treatment or preventive services won't affect someone's immigration status under the new, highly criticized public charge rule, which took effect last month and which punishes immigrants who need public assistance. The agency acknowledged that some immigrants may fear seeking health care in the wake of the virus, saying that it will neither consider testing, treatment, nor preventive care related to the virus in determining someone's eligibility for permanent residency. It said that those who can't work or attend school and must rely on public benefits during the duration of the virus outbreak and recovery can later explain and provide documentation, and that will be taken into consideration. There's my point right there that I was mentioning earlier. Provide documentation. What kind of documentation might someone have? I, for example, am staying home. I still have my job. I'm still being paid. If I were not, though, what sort of documentation would I have? Being fired or being laid off doesn't necessarily include that kind of information. It might, but it might not. So anyway, that's a tricky point about this. Back to the story. The announcement came after lawmakers and advocacy groups urged the government to suspend the rule during the coronavirus outbreak. Advocates say that they have been fielding panicked calls from immigrants who are worried about the impact on their status if they seek health care. Angelica Salas, executive director for the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights in Los Angeles, said her group and others held a news conference urging immigrants to seek care if needed and reminding them that their health and the health of their families is most important. People are wondering about their vulnerability both in terms of disease, but their vulnerability in terms of immigration status, in terms of being discovered, she said. Salas said she doesn't fully trust the Trump administration, but feels confident that state, county, and local authorities will support immigrants who come forward to seek health care they need, regardless of their immigration status. Advocates have long derided the public charge rule, which punishes immigrants who are in the country legally and who are allowed to access some benefits, such as food stamps for their American-born children. As the coronavirus began to spread more widely in the U.S., supporters and lawmakers cautioned it could be detrimental to public health if some immigrants were too afraid to seek care. Ivan Espinoza Madrigal, executive director of Lawyers for Civil Rights in Boston, said his organization got a request for legal support from a woman who worked in hospitality industry in Chelsea, Massachusetts. The woman said her work schedule is in flux and she doesn't have a steady income. She wanted to apply for food stamps for her 9-year-old son, a U.S. citizen, but was too afraid. Now, with her son's school closing down indefinitely, she was even more concerned.